Listen closely and listen like a man who refuses to be lied to again. Tonight I will pry open a silence that has been held with violence and law. Tonight I will show you how power hides itself beneath the soil and calls its price. The hook is simple and it is savage. 5 men walked into the mountain and never walked back out. Not absent by accident but taken by consequence of a door they forced open. Hear the first sound now, the wind through pine branches like paper on a crate. Hear the second sound, closer and impossible, the whisper that answers in a voice you know but do not recognize. This is the moment you feel something change inside you, a hinge shifting, a recognition that authority has lied. The Blackwood brothers were not simple miners, they were architects of discovery and of danger. Isaiah the eldest, who spoke like a man who brokered futures, Elijah the quiet one who read maps like scripture, Jeremiah the student who mapped stars like instruction for digging. They hired experts and brought instruments like priests bringing sacrament to an altar. They sealed doors like vaults and built chambers like secrets. They measured with brass dials, they bowed to no rumor, and still they found themselves afraid. Listen to this cadence of unease and let it settle into the place in your chest that habits cannot reach. The mine was on hollow ridge where the land swallows sound and animals refuse to feed. This is not decorative detail, it is the point of entry, it is the threshold, a place where the ordinary rules of cause and effect soften. They called the stone black iron, though it answered to none of the names of men. It reacted to current like a living mirror, it hummed in patterns and left hands numb. Men who touched it began to hear things in the walls and to sleep with their eyes open. A rational report would call it gas or madness or a cave-in, and the county would file it away under the neat word unexplained. But when men with education and instruments and contracts vanish without a trace, you must suspect something other than accident. You must suspect a governance of silence, a system that chooses what the public may see and what it will bury. This story is not meant to entertain, it is meant to teach you how power buries inconvenient truths and how memory survives where paper fails. Keep your senses alert and your disbelief reserved, because what follows is not folklore alone, it is an anatomy of cover-up and of something that listens to sound and answers to it. When the brothers began the dig, they did not advertise what they wanted. They hired hands for the surface and kept the shafts for themselves. They built a strong room with no windows and doors heavy as courtrooms. They brought crates stamped with unknown marks and instruments whose function the locals could not name. Watch closely here, because secrecy is always dressed like legitimacy. Contracts bound men to silence with penalties sharp enough to cut a life. Why pay 3 times the wage and why lock away every ledger if you seek only coal? Because the discovery was not about coal, it was about a line crossed and a resonance found that should have remained buried. The local accounts describe nights when lamps guttered and animals went silent. Neighbors mention hands trembling and voices answered from empty rooms. The barber saw a man inspect the back of his own neck like a keeper of a mark, and the postman watched a stoic farmer read a letter and become a man who might run. What the Blackwoods found responded to electricity and to proximity. It sang when wired and it hummed as if in harmonic with human fear. Engineers wrote in careful ink about tremors and resonance that did not belong to geology alone. A mining engineer called Thomas, who had worked the hard seams up north, kept a journal of the strange. He noted how the samples maintained a resonance regardless of distance. He wrote of numbness and a tremor that would not leave his fingers. He wrote the name black iron and underlined it like a summons. This is where the story steepens into menace, because trained men began to report phenomena that read like language and acted like will. They sealed lower chambers to slow what moved in those walls, and then in a turn of human flaw they pushed further, not back. Greed and curiosity form a dangerous pair when the world offers a threshold and mankind mistakes it for a prize. When you study hidden power, you learn the arithmetic of consequence, and the Blackwoods learned it too late. Their ledger stopped in a page left open, a meal laid out, a rifle missing, and a bed dressed in clothes shaped like a man. These are the gestures of a man who planned to be away and hoped to return but did not understand what he had unlatched. Listen now as I map the anatomy of the cover-up that followed. Authorities arrive and declare no foul play, and they file it neat and small. A coal mine abandoned by choice, they wrote, and they walked away with the comfort of a report completed. Yet the men who investigated carried images in their heads like weights. Deputies who later confessed in family papers spoke of a feeling like standing at the lip of a void. They refused to cross certain thresholds and they left evidence unexplained in attics and boxes. A fisherman finds horses lame. The lanterns bought at auction refuse to light. The saws break under no strain. These are the ripples of an event that touches more than bodies. It touches reputation and commerce and the willingness of a town to speak its own shame. You must understand the mechanism of erasure to read this case fully. First remove the bodies and then remove the records and then persuade men with authority to look the other way. When someone pays handsomely for silence, they buy more than money. They buy a narrative, and narratives shape what a community remembers. But memory resists being purchased indefinitely. Neighbors still speak of voices in circles of dead grass, and the men who tried to investigate disappear or withdraw from public life. A graduate student who chased the paper trail found journals and then vanished on a service road near the site. A deputy who took home a leather-bound book found pages missing, and nightmares persistent enough to leave his career. These patterns show us a calculus of pressure where coercion and fear create a culture of forgetting. Note the tactics and learn them, because they are the tools any institution uses when its power is threatened. The Blackwood case reads like a manual for quieting dissent and for hiding dangerous knowledge. Yes, there may be geological explanations, and yes, human psychology can make a story monstrous. But when instruments fail in consistent ways and equipment is altered without fingerprints and data is removed from archives, then the explanation becomes political as well as natural. Power organizes what will be visible and what must remain in shadow. Pay attention where institutions close doors and where they mark file boxes with restricted access. That is how the world keeps its dangerous things inside while pretending nothing is amiss. The material they brought back from the shaft acted unlike known ore. It absorbed light in ways men could not account for, and it hummed in response to current. When professionals handle unknowns, their notebooks become the first altar of truth. Green and Walsh wrote letters home describing tremors and voices and a mineral that resonated like a bell. Walsh would become pale and tremble in shops, and he would tell a neighbor some things were not meant to be found. This confession from a geologist matters because his training should have offered containment, not terror. What the Blackwoods discovered had an economy of influence. It altered perception and decision-making. Those who spent time near the samples reported dreams that repeated across men who never met. They dreamed of circular rooms and walls that shifted when not being watched. A concept emerges here that will reappear in modern language. Thin places where boundaries between contexts loosen and the rules of cause and effect become porous. Ancient cultures feared such places and wrapped them in stories and rituals, and the Blackwoods broke into one without those protections. Think of it like a wound in the world, and think how a wound invites infection if not treated with reverence and care. The brothers thought they had a prize that would remake their fortunes and their names. Instead, they opened a cavity that listened and required sustenance of a kind no ledger can prepare you for. When men commit to secrecy, they do so because they fear the reaction of the public and because they think they can control the aftermath. They cannot. What follows the breach is a sequence of erosion and outcry and slow institutional amnesia. A petition signed by dozens asked authorities to seal and abandon the site, yet the paper trail would vanish. If you trace the pattern, you will see the choreography of erasure, a push toward forgetting performed across decades. Years later, those who tried to map the place hit the same wall of silence administered by equipment and by men. Geologists found circular depressions in perfect arrays and chambers with walls too regular to be natural. Archaeologists reported pottery shards that did not fit known styles and symbols carved into stone that defied cataloging. Students who descended into shafts described echoes that lasted too long and ropes that behaved like melted threads. Rescue teams found collapsed shafts where moments earlier the ground had been stable. These are not the accidents of time, they are the signatures of a phenomenon that interacts with instruments and perception alike. When field equipment fails only in one area, and when GPS and radios die when pointed at a center, you must consider more than geology. You must consider that the phenomenon alters the electromagnetic environment, or that it eats the patterns humans use to make sense of space. Researchers who published findings were sidelined, denied funding, or relocated. A physicist who tried to draw a connection to modern theoretical frameworks was denied tenure and disappeared from public debate. A map made by a federal agency marked the area as unverified due to instrument malfunction, and the scientist who explained the omission trembled when asked again. This is how systems protect themselves from anomalies that might disrupt resource extraction or national narratives of progress. Learn to see the pattern: the institutional shrug, the reassignment of personnel, the classified files, and the redaction. These are the administrative tendrils of containment that often outlast the physical event itself. The Blackwood mine became a blank spot on maps, a silence enforced by bureaucracy as much as by forest. And where bureaucracy fails, the land takes over the narrative with rings of dead earth and circles of denuded soil that grow in diameter like a contagion. Listen to the voices of the witnesses filtered through time and consider what is consistent across ages. A ranger who once tracked footprints into the circle felt a pressure in his skull like a hand pressing from the inside. A foreman who sealed the shaft wrote of headaches and equipment that hummed and then resigned and left the state. A woman who kept a journal said her father returned from the mine unreadable and then later said in her final days that the men were still listening. These are not ghost stories told for thrill, they are consistent human data points about a place that responds to presence. Modern sensing instruments have recorded microtremors nightly, and audio devices captured subsonic patterns that when amplified suggest repetitive elements. Analysts called them noise until patterns emerged that suggested communication, and then those findings were suppressed or explained away by contamination. A shepherd of data will tell you the simplest explanation should be favored, but when multiple independent witnesses report the same anomalous features, you cannot rely solely on Occam. You must widen your frame to include cultural memory and political motive. Places that deviate from natural expectation attract both the curious and the cautious. Academics want to peer inside and are warned off privately. Government officers redact and restrict access, citing hazard in ownership, and the public narrative calcifies into forgetfulness. Every time someone tries to dig deeper, a new obstacle appears: equipment fails or records vanish, or men who once spoke fall silent from fear or threat. Power is not only in the thing discovered, it is in the capacity to name and hide it. The Blackwood brothers discovered that their discovery could be contained in paper and brass and legal clause, but not in silence alone. The thing they touched responded and then demanded a currency it found sustainable in bloodline and attention. That detail will recur, and it will be hard to stomach. It is the logic of certain phenomena to seek continuity rather than closure, and to use the living as vessels for its persistence. Now listen closely as we move deeper into the architecture of suppression and the way institutions bend reality to protect what they value most. This is where the technical and the political conspire to bury truth and to retell it as harmless accident. You will learn to read the traces they leave when they cannot erase everything. First, the instruments fail in consistent ways, not random malfunctions but selective silence that maps to a center of influence. Ground-penetrating radar returns patterns that shift between scans as if the Earth itself renegotiates what it will reveal. Seismographs register microtremors at night that align to a cadence scholars later refuse to publish. Cameras overexpose frames at a critical moment, making a photograph disappear from the record without fingerprints on the film. Then the people who see are moved out of the conversation: academics reassigned or denied funding, bureaucrats promoted away from inconvenient sites. Notice the pattern and name it: containment by administration. Money and authority do not just buy silence, they create plausible narratives that translate fear into paperwork. A report will always have a cover page and a conclusion that says insufficient evidence or unremarkable geological features. Those conclusions are rarely wrong by accident. They are the product of incentives that reward closure and punish curiosity that threatens a comfortable conclusion. If you want to understand power, observe how evidence is reclassified and how access is restricted. Files sealed with red tape become the moat around a secret garden where only chosen figures may enter. I will tell you now about the human cost of this bureaucracy. The graduate student obsessed with the ledger leaves a note about being followed and then disappears on a service road near the site. A deputy who takes home a leather journal wakes to nightmares and leaves the county for his health. A geologist finds a cluster of circular depressions and is later denied tenure after publishing preliminary data. These are not coincidences, they are signals that proximity to certain questions invites professional ruin or worse. When state archives list a report as lost during a routine relocation, learn to hear the euphemism for intentional removal. When a field team reports equipment corrupted by unexplained electromagnetic interference and then their findings are excised from the final publication, learn to suspect intervention. The Blackwood case is a lesson in how societies prefer tidy endings even when reality refuses to conform. We teach men to trade certainty for safety, and in that bargain many dangerous things are left to fester beyond sight. Remember this when you see a redaction notice or a sealed box. The absence of a document is itself a piece of evidence that must be treated with the gravity of a found corpse. Do not be distracted by the comfort of official closure, instead be driven by the inverse logic of what remains unread and restricted. Stand at the lip of the descent where rumor gives way to method and method reveals intention. Hear how the narrative tightens around the Blackwood story as actors shift from honest laborers to gatekeepers of consequence. This is the moment when expertise becomes authority and authority becomes a wall between public and forbidden. The engineers who measured oddity vanish from the record and institutions rearrange files. Notice how language is weaponized to soothe the curious and to terrify the persistent. Technical terms become euphemisms like anomaly or unverified readings so fear can be catalogued and shelved. Experts who press for excavation face reassignment and grant money evaporates like mist. Private correspondence disappears and chain of custody is redefined to exclude inconvenient pages. When evidence changes hands, it often changes shape to fit the preferences of those who control it. Institutions do not only protect property, they protect narratives that justify power. Understand that repeated instrument failure at Hollow Ridge is patterned and targeted. A camera fails when pointed toward the center, a recorder captures whispers only at certain frequencies, a drill stalls at a measured depth. These are not glitches but signatures left by whatever rules that space. To enter this history is to confront an apparatus of omission made from policy memos and polite refusals. Learn the vocabulary of containment where restricted access and environmental hazard become shields. Behind those shields sit committees that decide which facts will breathe and which will be smothered. Containment is people trading curiosity for career and communities coerced into forgetting. When a university refuses to publish and a state agency classifies a map, silence is curated to look like prudence. Consider the human cost in receipts and empty chairs and archives that close on grief. Scholars who seek truth are offered positions elsewhere or simply not invited back. Interrogate absence as fiercely as presence. Ask who benefits when a file cannot be opened and who gains when a corridor of caves is labeled unstable. Patterns repeat across time and place, and when you see them you will know you read not folklore but a manual of containment. If you follow this path, be ready to lose comforts and reputations for the sake of stubborn clarity. This account is not a tale for passive consumption, it is a summons to vigilance. Stay alert, guard your questions, and do not be silenced ever. You are at the fork where history becomes ritual and ritual becomes weapon. Listen closely for this part, it changes how you carry knowledge forward. We must speak plainly about methods of resonance that hide behind scientific words. The Blackwood site taught men to measure what should not be measured and to name the unnameable in polite language. They called it containment, yet containment meant altering maps and erasing ledgers and arranging silence. Hear this truth and hold it like iron in your palm. Power organizes forgetting as much as it organizes archives. When something is valuable enough to change the rules, those who control access make the rules rather than answer questions. Notice how certain actors appear repeatedly. Researchers reassigned grants cut or denied, files marked unverified. A university calls it a failed replication, a government agency calls it procedural closure. None of these phrases are neutral, they are verbs that move evidence from light into shadow. If you want to see how a secret survives, watch how institutions rearrange the record and how people who press for more are quietly moved aside. There is also the human component, the men who chose to look deeper despite cost. They are teachers of risk and they teach by example. If you are listening, you are being trained unconsciously by every report of someone who refused to be polite and asked the wrong question. Midway through this descent, I ask you to participate and lock in what you now know. Type into the comments the phrase Iron Vigil twice, Iron Vigil twice. Do this as a ritual of recognition, not as performance but as witness to a truth that will not be catalogued easily. Repeat the phrase twice in the comments to bind your attention and mark you as a seeker with a new clarity. To speak is to claim a small victory and to invite others into the same uneasy light. Now understand the mechanism that follows when knowledge is dangerous. The state of denial becomes an infrastructure. Hear how committees meet and how minutes are redacted and how maps are reclassified as topography unverified. These administrative acts are not neutral, they are strokes of protection for power and knives for memory. Follow where this leads and you will find that the fight is never with elements but with the rules that govern which elements may be acknowledged. By the turn of the century, the story of the Blackwood Brothers had already become local scripture, whispered beside fires where light could not reach. The tree-lean and the wind carried words like prayer and curse in the same breath. The mine mouth was said to breathe on its own, exhaling a mist that smelled of rust and wet stone. And those who camped too near swore they heard something moving deep below, like a heartbeat too slow to belong to a man. But men kept coming, scientists, prospectors, soldiers, all drawn by rumors of strange metals found in fragments around the collapsed shaft, samples that glowed faintly when struck and pulsed faintly under certain frequencies. The reports always ended the same: abrupt funding cuts, sealed archives, missing notebooks. One geologist went mad, carving spirals into his cabin walls before vanishing into the forest, leaving behind maps drawn in circles that made no sense until viewed from above, where they formed the same symbol etched over the mine entrance. The deeper you go, the clearer the pattern becomes. It was never about discovery, it was about resonance. The mine was built where older stones already hummed to a hidden geometry, an ancient design that fed on human attention. And when the Blackwood brothers dug through the last layer of untouched earth, they did not uncover treasure, they completed a circuit. That is why every report since then speaks of vibrations in the soil, compasses spinning, lights dimming, electronics failing, all symptoms of a field that reacts to awareness itself. The deeper the gaze, the stronger the pulse, as though the mountain learns the mind of the one who looks. Those who study it disappear not by accident but by consequence. Knowledge in this place is an exchange you cannot take without giving something in return, and those who go too far lose more than their names. They lose the coordinates of their own thoughts, like being erased from both memory and map. The institutions know this, they file it under environmental anomaly, they rename the site geological hazard, yet still they monitor it. Satellites pass overhead every October, scanning for subtle movements under the surface, and each year the pattern grows sharper, circles within circles aligning perfectly, as if waiting for the right mind to finish what began in 1879. By 1911 a new expedition was quietly organized under the guise of a mining reclamation survey. The men chosen were not locals, they were government contractors wearing civilian clothes and carrying equipment decades ahead of what anyone in the Smoky Mountains had ever seen. They came with blueprints, sealed crates, and a single instruction: site must remain isolated at all times. They set up camp 2 miles from the mine, erecting steel pylons around its perimeter that locals later described as humming fences. No explanation was ever offered, and within weeks the entire team was gone. No reports, no bodies, no equipment, only scorched earth where the pylons had been. When questioned years later, a former clerk from the Department of the Interior revealed fragments of internal correspondence referring to Project Black Vein, a classified investigation into subterranean acoustic anomalies that matched the coordinates of the Blackwood site. One memo warned that the frequencies emitted from the mine exhibited intelligent modulation, suggesting a responsive source. The official response was to terminate the study and restrict the area under permanent federal control. It is said that after that year the birds stopped nesting on that side of the mountain. Hunters found deer carcasses near the old path. Their organs collapsed as if from internal vibration, and the stream running from the ridge carried metallic residue that shimmered beneath the moonlight. Men began to speak again of the Blackwood brothers, of their voices echoing through the mine as if the stone itself had learned to repeat their fear. In the nearby town of Wayland Gap, a preacher began warning his congregation that the mountain had opened a wound that could not close. He claimed the brothers had trespassed on something older than the world, something that used sound instead of blood to feed. When asked how he knew, he said he heard them singing through the wind and that the words were not human. Since then the mine has been sealed 3 times, each attempt undone by landslides and unexplained tremors, as if the earth itself refused to forget what happened there. And perhaps it never will, because some places are not meant to be buried, they remember and they call. By 1913 the mine had become a forbidden subject in Wayland Gap. Those who dared speak of it did so in whispers behind closed doors. Even the children were warned never to wander near the Blackwood Ridge, for the mountain was said to breathe. Still, the town's new sheriff, Henry Murdoch, decided to investigate after reports of lights flickering deep within the valley. Locals told him it was just the swamp gas, but Murdoch was not a man to fear superstition. He took 2 deputies and hiked toward the mine under a waning moon. They never returned. 2 days later the search party found one deputy's lantern half buried in ash, the glass cracked but the flame still burning despite the rain that had fallen all night. There were no footprints, no blood, no signs of struggle, only the faint humming that seemed to come from beneath their feet, the same hum the old men remembered from the pylons 12 years earlier. Those who heard it described it as a sound that crawled into the skull and pulsed with their heartbeat. Soon after, strange weather settled over the valley, storms forming out of clear skies, thunder that rattled bones but never echoed, lightning that struck the same hill again and again. Farmers lost cattle, their bodies bloated into discolored black veins webbing across their hides. The doctors from Little Rock examined one of the corpses and quietly burned it without report. By morning the air itself felt thicker, as though the valley were suffocating under something unseen. That winter the church bells in Wayland Gap began to ring at random hours. No one could find who or what triggered them. The sound came even when the ropes were cut, each toll deeper, more distorted. The pastor finally abandoned the chapel, claiming that the tone of the bells was no longer human, it had changed, carrying the same vibration the miners once heard beneath the ground. When spring came, not a single bird returned to the ridge, and those who lived closest began hearing voices at night. They said it was the Blackwood brothers calling from the dark, asking to be let out, but others believed it was not them at all, that the thing buried in the mine had simply learned to speak their names. By the summer of 1914 the valley was nearly abandoned. The few who stayed lived like prisoners inside their homes, boarding windows, sealing chimneys, whispering prayers that no longer felt like they reached anyone. The mountain had grown silent, too silent. Even the wind refused to pass through its pines, but on certain nights when the moon was hidden and fog wrapped the ground like a shroud, people claimed to see figures standing at the edge of the old mining path, not walking, not breathing, just standing. Sheriff Murdoch's wife was one of the last to leave. She told her neighbors she saw her husband outside her window one night, drenched in soot, his eyes white as frost. He whispered something she could barely hear before vanishing. The words were said to be, "You dug too deep." Mrs. Hargrove, who lived next door, confirmed the sighting but insisted the man she saw wasn't breathing. His reflection in her glass moved even when she stood still. After that the town's exodus became total. Within weeks only the trees remained to remember what was buried below. Then came the letter. The governor's office received it without return address, postmarked from Knoxville. Inside were 5 pages written in shaking cursive describing tunnels that led downward in perfect circles like a spiral into the earth. The author claimed to have found an entrance not in the mine but behind the church graveyard where the soil was still warm. He wrote that the tunnels were lined with symbols matching those carved by the Blackwood brothers, and that the deeper he went the louder the humming became, until it sounded like thousands of voices breathing as one. The last line of the letter read, "If anyone enters again, the mountain will open completely." The governor dismissed it as a hoax until a week later, when tremors shook the Smoky Mountains and fissures split through the ridge. For 7 days the earth moaned like a wounded animal and black mist poured from the cracks. Travelers on the rail line reported seeing faces in that smoke, eyes like mirrors staring back. No one ever found the author of that letter, but handwriting analysts confirmed it matched an earlier miner's report from 1879 signed by William Blackwood himself. The tremors ended as suddenly as they began, but what remained was worse: silence, absolute and unnatural, the kind of silence that bends the air and presses against your ribs. The people who dared to return found the valley split into 2 halves, as if something beneath had clawed upward from within. The mine entrance was gone, replaced by a jagged pit that exhaled a faint vapor smelling of iron and ash. Yet those who stood too close swore they could hear distant voices calling their names, not in echo but in perfect imitation. A group of surveyors was sent in autumn to assess the damage. Among them was a geologist named Frank Deleru, who kept a journal. Later recovered from his abandoned tent, he wrote that the soil was magnetic, drawing compass needles toward the crater, that animals refused to go near, that trees along the slope were burned not from flame but from something colder, a kind of inverse heat that froze bark from the inside. On the 4th night he claimed to have seen lights beneath the ground moving in a slow pulse like veins of dim silver alive beneath the surface. Locals began calling it the Blackwood Pulse, and the legends evolved. Some said the brothers had dug too far and unearthed an ancient engine that powered more than the earth, that it was still running, that every 100 years it called back what it had borrowed from the living. Preachers came and left, scientists arrived and vanished. Every institution that tried to study it ended their records with missing pages and the same phrase scrawled at the end: "The mine breathes." By winter the air itself became unstable. Compasses failed, watches stopped, birds flew in spirals until they fell dead. The river near the town turned black, then clear again. In one night the bodies of fish were gone, leaving only outlines in the mud like shadows burned into memory. And yet despite every warning there was always someone who thought they could enter, who believed knowledge could conquer what fear had preserved. These were the men who vanished without trace, leaving only torn maps and empty lamps found days later still warm, as if their owners had simply stepped through a door that closed behind them forever. In early spring a federal research team arrived under the guise of geological surveyors, but their trucks carried more than instruments. They brought sealed crates lined with lead and heavy machinery designed not for mining but for containment. Men in gray uniforms set up perimeter fences and marked the soil with symbols no one recognized. Some said they were alchemical sigils, others said military codes. The townspeople were told to stay away, but at night lights flickered from deep within the pit, and the faint hum of generators could be heard echoing across the valley like the heartbeat of something waking up. An old shepherd named Amos Pike, who lived closest to the site, claimed to see them lower a black sphere the size of a carriage into the crater by crane. After that the air began to vibrate constantly as if the ground itself was whispering through the bones of anyone who stood nearby. Within a week Amos was found wandering miles away barefoot, muttering about tunnels of light and a door made of teeth. His words made no sense, yet they matched the old stories of the Cherokee who once called that mountain cursed long before the Blackwood family ever mined it. A government report surfaced decades later, redacted almost completely, but one fragment survived. It read: containment unsuccessful, resonance at 3.9 MHz, subjects unresponsive, presumed lost beneath strata. No further exploration authorized. The phrase subjects unresponsive was repeated twice, as though whoever typed it was not sure what word to use instead of dead. After the operation the town began to rot slowly. Foundations shifted without cause, mirrors refused to reflect faces properly, and shadows grew longer at dusk. Even when the sun was high, children were born with strange birthmarks shaped like spirals or concentric circles, as if the curse had found a new way to breathe through blood. By the 1930s the name Blackwood was erased from state maps. The remaining families were relocated, but old miners swore that on certain nights when lightning strikes the ridge the pit glows faintly and a low hum answers back like a voice remembering itself through the static of the earth. Some secrets, it seems, do not stay buried, they only wait for silence to return. By the 1950s the legend of the Blackwood Brothers had twisted into something between folklore and classified rumor. Truckers passing through the Smoky Mountains reported strange interference in their radios around the old mine site, garbled whispers in languages that were neither English nor Cherokee. Some said the voices were reciting coordinates, others said they were counting backwards towards something unseen. Decades of rain and erosion had sealed most of the entrance, but the hum beneath the soil persisted like a pulse waiting for a signal. A journalist named Eleanor Graves came from Nashville chasing the story. She spent 3 weeks interviewing descendants of the miners and combing through the county archives before disappearing without trace. The only clue left was her tape recorder found near the ruins of an old pump station. The reel captured 32 minutes of audio. The first 20 were static, but the last 12 contained a man's voice whispering Eleanor in a tone that was neither human nor electronic. The FBI confiscated the tape, but a leaked transcript from a retired agent described it simply as impossible resonance. Locals began calling the valley the womb because everything that entered it seemed to be unmade. Hunters lost sense of direction, compasses spun uncontrollably, and even animals avoided the path leading to the mine site. The few who camped there spoke of hearing metallic breathing beneath the ground. One boy described seeing what looked like human silhouettes pressed against the rock wall as if frozen mid-scream. The government fenced off the entire area by 1962, marking it as a protected geological anomaly, yet military aircraft were often seen circling above during storms. Some nights the sky itself flickered in inverted colors, white lightning flashing, black shadows rolling upward against gravity. What no one could explain was how the Blackwood surname continued to appear in property deeds across states long after the bloodline had supposedly ended. Documents signed by heirs who did not exist, names that matched the lost brothers perfectly but dated 50 years apart, like signatures written by ghosts pretending to remain alive. It wasn't just a haunting anymore, it was a continuation, something still claiming ownership from beneath. In 1971 a geologist named Dr. Samuel Keene led a private expedition into the restricted Blackwood site, funded quietly by an anonymous donor. His team was equipped with seismic recorders and deep-bore listening devices. They expected to find signs of underground water or gas pockets. Instead, what they discovered defied every form of measurement. The instruments picked up vibrations that repeated every 11 minutes, precise and deliberate like a code, but not from any known machine. The sound resembled synchronized hammering, faint at first but growing louder the deeper they drilled, as if something below recognized their intrusion. Keene's notes were found weeks later in a hotel room in Asheville. His handwriting deteriorated toward the final pages, words blending into jagged loops. The last legible sentence read, "It is not a mine, it is a door." After that his trail vanished. No body, no equipment. The site was resealed under the pretext of safety regulation. The government labeled the recordings geological feedback and quietly buried the data. But copies survived. Someone leaked fragments to underground radio in the late 70s. The broadcasts aired once before being cut off. Listeners reported nausea and auditory hallucinations. One claimed he could hear names being whispered, his own among them. Another swore he felt a tug behind his eyes, like something trying to see through him. The station burned down a month later, ruled accidental despite the pattern of scorch marks forming what firefighters described as a perfect spiral on the concrete floor. Even today the spiral symbol appears etched into nearby trees, scratched into stone, or drawn in ash outside old cabins. Each time it points toward the direction of the old Blackwood shaft. The legend says those who follow it during a thunderstorm will hear the brothers singing beneath the ground, not as miners but as something transformed, their voices harmonizing with the storm itself, like the mountains were breathing through them. Some believe the Blackwood curse was never about punishment but about inheritance, that whatever the brothers uncovered beneath that mountain was knowledge meant only for those willing to lose themselves entirely, to become part of it, not as men but as resonances, sound eternal and unbound. The mind still stands sealed behind layers of rock fencing and silence. The government calls it unstable territory, but locals whisper that no matter how much earth they pile on top, the hum never stops, it rises. Through the soil like breath, it travels through steel like memory. The ground itself has become an echo of the Blackwood brothers. It remembers their rhythm, their defiance, their descent. Old men at the edge of the Smoky Mountains still talk about the hum on quiet nights. They say if you press your ear to the ground you can hear two voices chanting slow and heavy in perfect unison. Some say it is warning, others say it is worship, but those who hear it too long never come back the same. They start muttering in their sleep, tapping walls, counting steps in multiples of 11, like their minds have tuned into something the body can't forget. The truth of the Blackwood curse was never in superstition, it was in the transformation of men who touched the forbidden. The miners did not vanish, they became what they uncovered. They merged with the machinery of the earth. The mine was not a wound, it was an aperture, a place where the line between man and matter dissolved, where sound became flesh and fear became song. Every institution that tried to erase the story failed. The records burned but reappeared. The land was closed but never quiet. The legend kept breathing because some knowledge refuses burial. It mutates, it hides in vibrations, in dreams, in the hum beneath our feet. That is the sin. Society could not bury the sin of becoming one with what should have remained unseen. So if you ever travel near the Smoky Mountains and the air grows still and your breath feels heavy, remember this story of Ezra Coons and the Blackwood brothers was not meant for comfort. It was a warning, the kind that asks, what would you do if you heard the mountain whisper your name twice in the dark? Would you run or would you listen? Because once you listen, you are no longer just hearing, you are answering.